Good evening, everyone. In my last lecture, I told the remarkable story of the Boleyn family, a dynasty that rose in 4 generations from Norfolk gentry to produce one of the greatest monarchs in English history. And of course, I don't mean Anne Boleyn, I mean Elizabeth I, who of course was a Boleyn. Their rise was founded on money from the City of London, but it was consolidated through a series of spectacular marriages that brought huge wealth and with it influence. Court connections were vital too, and there's no doubt that Thomas Boleyn's rise was aided by his intimate friendship with Henry VIII, a relationship that amazingly survived the execution of his daughter for high treason. My last lecture is still on the college website, but just to quickly remind you, if you weren't there, here is Geoffrey Boleyn, the founder of the dynasty, who's a rich city merchant. He buys 2 houses, Blickling and Hever. He marries into an aristocratic family, inherits a house at Luton Hoo. His son, William, inherits Hever and Hoo. Then they get 2 more houses through another brilliant marriage. And so Anne Boleyn's father and his brother between them own, as you can see, a large number of spectacular mansions. Now, what's interesting about this story, about the Boleyns, is that until Anne became queen, none of them were great architectural patrons. None of them built a new house. Here's Hever Castle. It was obviously a very old house. And although they extended and modified and improved the houses that they bought or inherited, it's impossible to see architecture as one of the driving forces in their rise to and maintenance of power. There are reasons for this, which we shall turn to later, but there is a sense that the Boleyns enjoyed and capitalized on the family connections embodied in the buildings that they acquired, rather than having a passion for creating new ones. Tonight, I'm going to tell a very different story, but I'm going to be referring back to the Boleyns because the contrast between tonight's dynasty and the Boleyns is very revealing. But first, a very important point. The Boleyns were effectively snuffed out as a leading family by the late 16th century. Through the tragedy of Anne's marriage and then her execution and the execution of her brother, the Boleyns exited the national stage and their estates were divided up and dispersed. The Cecil family, the subject of my lecture this evening, have been one of the most resilient and successful aristocratic dynasties in English history. Although some of the original estates and houses amassed in the 16th and 17th century are now gone, the family has continued to play a remarkable role in national politics and culture and still retain 3 of the most remarkable Jacobean mansions in the country. As a result, there's no way I can cover the whole history of the family, and I'm going to be concentrating my remarks on the founding years and their period of outstanding architectural patronage. Now, the rise of the Cecils was inextricably connected with the rise of the Tudors. Both families were Welsh, and David Cecil, who was born in around 1460, rose on the coattails of his godfather, or maybe it was his uncle, Sir David Philip, who was in the household of Lady Margaret Beaufort, Henry VII's mother. There she is. There, Philip rose to become one of her closest and most trusted servants. And it's likely that David Cecil fought alongside Sir David Philip at the Battle of Bosworth and then followed him to Lincolnshire, where Lady Margaret Beaufort had not only extensive landed and commercial interests, but one of her favourite residences, which was Collyweston House. In 1488, Sir David was made bailiff of Collyweston and took a large house in Stamford, only 4 miles away. And there he set David Cecil up with Alice Dickens, the daughter of a wealthy merchant and alderman of the town. So there is David Cecil marrying Alice Dickens. This family tree will grow this evening. You may wonder why it's so small at the moment. It won't remain that way for long. Well, who says connections don't matter? A Tudor loyalist with a route into the royal family and a foothold on the ladder of local power, David Cecil quickly became a leading local figure, serving as an MP in Henry VII's last parliament and 4 of Henry VIII's parliaments. In his will, proved in 1541, he styled himself Esquire. But there was no great financial legacy left to his only son, Richard, who had to wait until his stepmother died before coming into any substantial property. But crucially, David Cecil saw to it that his son got a place in the royal household, where he became a page in Henry VIII's chamber by 1517. Now, the pages were responsible for keeping the king's chambers clean, the fires lit, and doing all the menial work in the royal lodgings. And Richard Cecil must have been diligent and personable because he was promoted to become a gentleman of the chamber by 1540, and concurrently, he got a place in the king's wardrobe of the robes, becoming a groom by 1528 and a yeoman of the robes by 1539. It was a cosmopolitan existence, travelling round the kingdom on royal progress and accompanying Henry VIII to Guisnes for the Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520. He rubbed shoulders with the good and the great, and he spent a lot of time personally with the king. And all his court posts attracted a salary. But far more important than the salary was the opportunity to petition the king or his ministers for other crown offices. Richard got his first post in 1517, and to this he added a sheaf of keeperships, bailiwicks, and stewardships, each one of which attracted a salary and some fees. And these fruits of office were extremely cannily invested in property. He first took leases in Lincolnshire from Lady Margaret's former estate in around 1519, when he married Jane Heckington, the daughter of a well-off local gentleman. So there is David and Alice, here is Richard Cecil, and here is Jane Heckington, his wife. He then continued with the purchase of the reversion of Little Burghley, of Burghley, and of neighbouring lands from Sir William Compton in 1527. But his big opportunity came, as it did for so many Tudor courtiers, with the dissolution of the monasteries, which in 5 years yielded him in succession Stamford Nunnery, Stamford Priory, and Stamford Friary, to which he added in 1544 the manor of Essendine in Rutland. His son and heir was William. Just as his grandfather had ruthlessly used his connections to get Richard a place at court, so Richard Cecil manoeuvred his clever young son William into St John's College, Cambridge, which, of course, had been founded by Lady Margaret Beaufort. Here he had as his tutor, amongst others, Thomas Smith, of whom more in a moment. But William never finished his studies, as he fell in love with Mary Check, the sister of one of his tutors, and against his father's wishes, he married her. And you can see that, his first marriage, Mary Check. After bearing him a son, Thomas, his first wife Mary died, and less than 2 years later, he married Mildred Cook. The first marriage was a love match. The second marriage was a career move. Sir Anthony, who you see here, Mildred's father, was a noted scholar. He was also one of Henry VIII's gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, an important post that brought him into intimate contact with the king. And here is Mildred, who you'll hear more about later. After Henry VIII's death, in the reign of Edward VI, Mildred's father became one of Edward's tutors. But as an evangelical, he was forced to spend most of Mary's reign abroad. So the important point about the family tree is that the young William Cecil now had two routes into court, through his father, Richard, but also through his father-in-law, Sir Anthony. And the young William was therefore able to come to the notice of Henry VIII, who was so impressed with him that he was granted the reversion of the keepership of the writs and rolls in the Court of Common Pleas, an office which he was to take up in the reign of Edward VI. It's worth pausing for a moment now in this story, because it was at court where the Boleyns and the Cecils must have met. We've got no record of this, but Richard Cecil would have known Thomas Boleyn well, because both of them were in the King's Privy Chamber. And at this juncture, of course, the Cecils were esquires to the much grander and aristocratic Boleyns. Thomas Boleyn's blood coursed with aristocratic corpuscles. These were injected into his veins by marriage alliances that his families had made, and even in disgrace, his daughter's marriage to the king had irreversibly enriched the family, and their wealth remained on a vast scale to the modest estates of the Lincolnshire Cecils. But whatever gifts Thomas Boleyn had, they were not particularly intellectual. The young William Cecil, however, and this is not him young, this is him much older, was not only highly intelligent, but had been trained at Cambridge by some of the most brilliant minds of his age. After 5 years, he left fluent in Greek and Latin, in French and Spanish, adroit at maths, schooled in political philosophy and in rhetoric. Richard, his father, then guided him to the Inns of Court, where at Gray's Inn he entered the vocational part of his training. The end game wasn't to be a lawyer, but to be equipped to serve his sovereign at court. It was probably through his father-in-law that Cecil became secretary to Protector Somerset in the early part of Edward VI's reign. And it was working for Somerset that Cecil got his introduction to architecture. Now, Edward Somerset, who you see a picture of here, the Duke of Somerset, the first Duke, was the most important architectural patron of the mid-16th century. Although Somerset House on the Strand still bears his name, it was far from his only commission. Hilary Mantel has made his Wiltshire house, Wolf Hall, almost as famous as Somerset House in her fictional account of Henry VIII's reign. But of all his buildings, Somerset Place, as it was then known, is the most important. As this building was conceived in his mind, Somerset's inner circle contained the three most important figures in the development of 16th century architecture in England. John Thynne was his building agent, and he commissioned Longleat House. Then there was Thomas Smith, who, of course, Cecil knew from his time at Cambridge. He was the builder of Hill Hall, which still exists. You can still see it. And, of course, there was William Cecil himself. And for these three men, Architecture was a passion. Thomas Smith was appointed clerk to the Privy Council and master of Somerset's Court of Requests, and both these bodies met at Somerset House. And Cecil then succeeded Smith in Somerset's Court of Requests, and both of them became Secretaries of State. And so it's really inconceivable that Thynne, Smith, and Cecil, together with Seymour, wouldn't have discussed every detail of Somerset Place as it rose on the Strand. Well, here is the quite well-known early drawing of the Strand facade of Somerset Place. This was a building that was designed to stand out, to be radical, to be ahead of its time. It was an expression in stone of Somerset's wider world picture, his political, religious, and economic programme of reform. And Somerset Place has got to be seen in the context of the increasing use of Renaissance architectural elements, a fact that began around 1515. Under Henry VIII, this was driven by the ability of Northern European craftsmen, but in the middle of the century, it was maintained by an increasing flow of prints and books that provided a rich stream of inspiration. And the Strand facade of Somerset Place represented at the time a new departure for English architecture. It introduced a treatment that, as bay windows, would be taken up at Longleat and as elsewhere as a core component of Elizabethan design. But probably the most novel element was the centrepiece, a feature based on the Roman triumphal arch, a fundamental ingredient in early Renaissance architecture, based on an easily understandable antique concept and well-preserved originals. Now, William Cecil managed to ride the turbulence of the mid-Tudor period, changing alliances and masters without losing his head and spending only a very brief spell in the Tower of London. His religious convictions caused him to withdraw from court under Mary, but in 1550 he secured a post in the Protestant household of Princess Elizabeth, becoming her surveyor. Now, by the provisions of Henry VIII's will, Mary had received estates worth about £4,000 a year, and Elizabeth estates worth about £3,000. Mary's were confirmed at the king's death in 1547, but Elizabeth, who was still a minor when her father died, had to wait until 1550 to come into hers. And amongst her lands were a number of royal houses. Hatfield, which you see here, Hatfield Old Palace, where her nursery was first established, a house at Ashridge, and one at Enfield, but also her grandmother's house, Collie Weston in Northamptonshire, which I've already mentioned. In London, she was granted the large house that had formerly belonged to the Bishop of Durham, Durham Place. And to the princess in 1550 now passed the responsibility for the repair and maintenance of all these houses, and this she delegated to William Cecil as her surveyor at a fee of £20 a year. So, Cecil's first appointment under Elizabeth was essentially one concerned with real estate, and in particular with Hatfield, Ashridge, and Enfield, the three houses that she favoured. Hatfield, which I shall return to later on, was an extremely fine house, much liked by Henry VIII, who constantly borrowed it from the bishops of Ely to whom it belonged. And here is an early plan of the house, which is at Hatfield House now. You can see it beautifully drawn. You can see it in its gardens. It was a handsome courtyard house. It only had one suite of state rooms, this suite here, overlooking the gardens. And it was in this suite that Elizabeth, as princess, lived. And in that suite, that William Cecil attended her as her surveyor, presumably with his deputy, who I think probably undertook most of the tedious everyday tasks of looking after her property interests. In London, Elizabeth barely ever used Durham House, and in 1553 the Duke of Northumberland engineered a swap whereby Elizabeth would have Somerset Place, while he would have Durham House added to his personal estate. And it was in this way that Princess Elizabeth came into possession of the most modern and striking townhouse in London, sited strategically on the Strand. And here you can see it. Here's the River Thames, wonderful gardens. Here's the house, big courtyard house on the Strand, the principal road between the city and Westminster. The house was, in fact, incomplete when Elizabeth took it on, and to make up for this, the Royal Office of Works was instructed to finish the half-built palace. A large sum of £900 was spent on the princess's new home, a place which, of course, her surveyor, Cecil, knew extremely well. Well, Mary died in November 1558, and Elizabeth was told at Hatfield, where she'd been based since 1555, that she was now queen. That very day, she chose the two men who were to be the key relationships in her life. Robert Dudley, who became the Earl of Leicester in 1564, and William Cecil, who became Lord Burghley in 1571. Now, Elizabeth was quite unlike her father. Henry had clearly defined ambitions, and his minister's job was quite simply to fulfill them. His daughter had no such programme. She was a pragmatist to the core. She waited on events, responding slowly, quite often hesitantly, usually asking and listening to William Cecil's advice which she might or might not take. She had no passion for building. Even if she had it, it would have been a strange thing for a woman who owned over 70 domestic residences to want to have more. Elizabeth was never a great patron of architecture. Indeed, she struggled to maintain the extensive estate that she had inherited. During the Elizabethan age, architectural initiative shifted from the crown to the ministers in its service. These men's wealth came not through salaries, which were negligible, but through the fruits of office and from gifts from the crown. And of all these servants, of course, William Cecil was the greatest. Cecil had always had a house at Burghley in Lincolnshire, as it now is. But his focus was in London, and he lived in a house in Cannon Row in Westminster, very handily placed for access to Whitehall and the offices, courts and councils at Westminster. And it was in this house that his elderly father died in 1553. But as his wealth and his confidence grew, he took the rectory at Wimbledon on a long lease. And here he based his wife, Mildred, and brought up his son, Thomas. This is a picture from Country Life magazine when it was on the market not so long ago. Many, many alterations since the days of the Cecils, but the house is essentially the same building. In the 16th century, most wealthy men had a suburban residence where they could retire from the business of London and Westminster. And although Wimbledon Rectory wasn't a new house, it was large, it was well-sited, and it was close to Westminster. But while Wimbledon was convenient for Westminster, a trip to Burghley was a major operation. And I love this well-known picture of William Cecil on his ass, and you can imagine what a long way it was to Northamptonshire. So, for instance, in May 1557, the journey from Wimbledon to Burghley involved his household getting to London by boat, and then the next morning travelling on to Royston, where they spent the night. The day after, they had dinner in Huntingdon and only reached Burghley at nightfall. And for a man as busy as Cecil, visiting his country estates could not be on impulse. Nevertheless, in around 1573, he decided to start building at Burghley a great country house. The impulse to do this had probably long existed, but the trigger was almost certainly his peerage in 1572, and the following year his appointment as Lord Treasurer and his receipt of the Order of the Garter. Cecil now had the status and the cash to make architectural waves. Unlike the Boleyns, who had the resources to build a new house if they had wanted, Cecil set out to build on a new ground. Also, unlike the Boleyns, who traded on their aristocratic connections and whose large 15th century mansions proclaimed them as part of the establishment, Cecil had come from relatively humble stock, and although he had land, he had no great mansion at its centre. Burghley House was an exercise in constructing a dynastic seat, a central act in his ambition to raise the Cecils from country gentry into the elite community of the 50-odd hereditary nobles. In 1572, Cecil took his title from Burghley, and it was to be left to his eldest son, Thomas. And in the rest of this lecture, I'm going to carry on calling them by their Christian names, because their titles, the names of the titles changed, and it's just quite confusing. So I'm just going to stick to their Christian names and carry on calling him William. So physical building at Burghley was accompanied by a systematic amassing of local power, influence, and assets. The estate which he built up, centred on Stamford, gave not only the income necessary for a peer, but gave him a base for regional power. Cecil became the steward and the recorder of Stamford, the steward of King's Lynn and Yarmouth, the recorder of Boston, surveyor of royal lands in Lincolnshire, keeper of Rockingham Forest and Cliff Park, and the steward of numerous royal estates in the area. He became Lord Lieutenant of Lincolnshire in 1587 and of Hertfordshire and of Essex in the following year. So Burghley House was primarily intended to be the seat of a great aristocrat wielding power locally as landed magnates had done for centuries. It might also be the venue for great national events connected with his offices of state. But we've got to remember, as this map shows, that Burghley House was a long way from London and not at all convenient for ambassadors or delegations unless they were to follow the Queen on progress. And although the Queen was once invited to stay, her plans changed at the last moment, and the state bed at Burghley was one of the few aristocratic beds in which Elizabeth never slept. Now, I've already explained that Cecil was part of a small group of avant-garde patrons of architecture in the circle of the Duke of Somerset. But his position as Lord Treasurer meant that he was also effectively in charge of the royal building works. He was more or less, if you like, the Elizabethan minister for architecture. Now, I'm not actually going to talk about this, but his intimate involvement in the details of royal buildings for 40 years was very important for two reasons. First, it meant that he had access to the best craftsmen and architects, which he deployed on his own building projects. But secondly, that he really deeply understood the functional requirements of a royal palaces. And this meant that his own houses could be designed to accommodate the royal visits if necessary. And so when we look at the west front of Burghley House, it was designed by one of the leading architects from the Office of Works, Henry Hawthorne, and it emphasised traditional architectural and social values with this great gatehouse and towers and turrets and bay windows. And inside, the Great Hall has a traditional hammer beam roof. The courtyard, however, is a masterly assemblage of classical elements focused on this extraordinary Tower of the Orders, which ultimately derives from the great gatehouse at Somerset House. Whilst much more correct in its deployment of the classical orders of architecture than most later Elizabethan buildings, Burghley is still a melange of classical elements, rather than a house that could have been built, for instance, in contemporary France, where the adherence to the rules of classical architecture was important, rather than just the decorative use of individual elements. The completed house, which was built in phases up until about 1588, was very big, but the principal suite of rooms was not, strictly speaking, a royal state suite. And you can see here the plan of the house originally. Here's the Great Hall. You ascended a spectacular staircase, and you came into a great chamber, a private or privy chamber, a bedchamber, a closet, and then a gallery. And whilst this is a very typical arrangement for a 16th century aristocrat, it had various shortcomings if it were to ever be used by the Queen herself. Now, given the extraordinary size and splendour of Burghley, why did Cecil embark on building a second country house at Tybbalds in 1563-4? Now, Tybbalds is written Theobalds, but it was always pronounced Tybbalds in the 16th and 17th century. Well, I think it's not very hard to explain this. Cecil was now enormously wealthy. It's very difficult to give a reliable figure for his total income, but his landed income was somewhere around £6,000 a year. But this figure kind of hardly matters because it was an enormous sum in contemporary values, and it didn't include all the fruits of his office, the financial fruits of his office. So he could afford to build, and he needed to build for two reasons. First of all, he had to have a house that was closer to London than Burghley. Burghley was 100 miles away, and his duties meant that he was glued to court, and he needed a house within a day's ride of London that would replace Wimbledon Manor as a suburban retreat that he could actually use. The second reason was actually dynastic, and here we need to turn back to the family tree. You'll see here his first marriage to Mary Check. His first son, his eldest son, was Thomas Cecil, who married a lady called Dorothy Neville. We'll come on to that in a moment. His second marriage, if you remember, is to Mildred, and he has Robert Cecil by that marriage, and Robert Cecil marries Elizabeth Brooke and has his own 3 children. And so William Cecil has 2 sons, and he needs two houses. His firstborn, Thomas, would inherit Burghley, he would the title and the house. So Tibbles was built and started for his second son, Robert. Well, having purchased Tibbles in 1563, he began a building programme which went on to about 1585. Completed, the house was gigantic. In fact, arguably the largest house in England at the time. His original intention wasn't to build something so large, but Elizabeth I really liked the place and wanted to come and stay, and to accommodate her and the whole court, the place had to be extended. The design, as far as we know it, was largely Burghley's own, and it became a model that was consulted by the other great Elizabethan and Jacobean builders. It wasn't the exterior of the house, and you see a drawing of it here, that impressed visitors. It was the astonishing series of interiors, where curiosity, delight, and spectacle created a theatre for the court. At the entrance, for instance, there was a huge bunch of grapes that gushed red and white wine. In the great chamber, there was a grotto with precious stones and figures of men and women and wild beasts creeping through the bushes, whilst the ceiling was constructed as the sky at night with a mechanical sun that moved across it. Tibbles was no normal house. It was to Elizabeth and Cecil what Hampton Court had been to Henry VIII and Wolsey. It was the architectural embodiment of their joint enterprise in running the country. Ownership was not the point. What was significant was the ability of monarch and minister to jointly enjoy the fruits of office. Elizabeth liked the house a lot, visiting on each of 11 years after 1571. Apparently, in 1583, she said, and I quote, that she was never in any place better pleased, and sure, the house, garden, and walks any compare with any delicate place in Italy. Her enthusiasm for the house led Cecil to start in around 1572 the construction of a whole new courtyard to the west of the house to contain two sets of lodgings, one for the Queen and a suite mirroring it for her consort. So the original house is this bit here. He then starts building this huge courtyard on here to provide two sets of lodgings, one for the Queen and one for the expected king, who she was expected to, of course, marry. So what had been achieved by 1603 was a house of royal proportions. In reality, too large for Cecil's taste or purse. And it's likely that even before it was finished, he was rather hoping that he might be able to pass this vast place on to the crown. But just before moving on to the second generation, to Cecil's two sons, Thomas and Robert, I should mention that William also flirted with the idea of building a great house in Chelsea in 1595-6, and in 1582 he bought Pym's Manor in Edmonton for his second son, Robert. He did this because it was very close to Tibbles and provided a house for Robert and his wife Elizabeth and their growing family of children close to Tibbles, which of course would be their eventual home. And so if we pause just to take stock, we can see that William managed to elevate his family vastly above his father's estate, acquiring his house in Cannon Row, a house in Wimbledon, a big house in Stamford, Burghley, Tibbles House, Burghley House London, that I'll mention in a few minutes, Pym's in Edmonton, and Beaufort House in Chelsea. And in addition to these, of course, there was all the land that came with them. But perhaps William's greatest achievement was transferring his offices and his power to his son, Robert. Now, Robert was perhaps not a natural-born courtier. In an age where a fine leg was the first step on the ladder to preferment, the hunchbacked Robert, only 5'4" tall, was not an obvious star. Famously, Queen Elizabeth called him my pygmy, and James I nicknamed him my little beagle. But behind the jests was a huge respect for a man who had inherited not only his father's job, but his father's genius. He was one of the key architects of James I's accession in 1603 and welcomed James to Tibbles just before his entry into his new capital. Well, James was completely blown away by the size and splendour of Tibbles' house, and very quickly a series of visits by the king resulted in him acquiring it from Cecil in exchange for lands that included a number of properties, including the manor of Hatfield. Now, acquiring a new house was quite a rare thing to do, but there was a big celebratory party at Tibbles as the house was handed over from minister to king. Now, only the merest fragments remain of this once vast mansion, but there is enough evidence to reconstruct it, at least in plan. And you see here, this is not my drawing, this is by another scholar called Martin Andrews. You can see how the house was not only approached by a great avenue into these three courtyards, it was surrounded by gardens, and these are a series of waterways and moats that surrounded it. The plan, in a little more detail, involved entering the first court, mounting the staircase from the Great Hall, and a classic series of royal chambers, presence, privy with drawing room, bedchamber, overlooking the gardens, and a long gallery overlooking more gardens here. There were a second suite of lodgings on this side was the one that was occupied by Elizabeth I, and another gallery here. And this area here was occupied by James I's son, with another gallery beneath that terrace on that side. Sadly, there is little information about the inside of this house, but a remarkable painting surviving in the royal collection, I think, does depict the Great Gallery. This shows Charles I and Henrietta Maria at Tibbles, whilst it's a royal palace, but I think you can begin to get a flavour of Cecil's house here and a glimpse into the long gallery which he built for Elizabeth I. Well, we have to remember that Robert Cecil's transition from Elizabethan to Jacobean royal secretary was far from guaranteed. And in the years after 1601, when it was clear that the Queen wasn't going to last much longer, he was very careful to build himself an insurance policy. He entered into a frenzy of land speculation, becoming one of the largest purchasers of crown lands, which were then flooding onto the property market to fund the war in Ireland. As well as spending some £30,000 in 1601-2, he borrowed heavily from the city to enable him to scoop up prime property on the market. And what this meant was that if all went according to plan, his position in government continued under James I, he'd be very well placed to impress and entertain his new king. But if his plans failed and he lost office, he could retire to his estates, plant his gardens, go hawking, and pass his estate onto his son, William. And one of these purchases, his sort of insurance policy, was the manor of Cranbourne in Dorset, which you can see on my map down here. He bought it as a hunting lodge, and when in 1604 James I created Robert a viscount, he took Cranbourne as his title. Here you see an estate map showing the house. The attraction of it was its grounds and, crucially, the parks and hunting in Cranbourne Chase that were available to it. Cecil asked the Somerset architect and mason William Arnold to convert the medieval house. He's one of the lesser-known geniuses of Jacobean design. He designed Montacute House and Wadham College, Oxford, as well as Cranbourne Manor, which you see here. And we know that Cecil spent hours closeted away with Arnold devising this scheme. It was a fascinating design that preserved the essentials of the medieval house. This is the medieval house in the dark colour. Ignore this is later. And you can see the way these new elements were added, which have a certain amount of Italianate classical design, but also very much show the house as a medieval house, as a traditional hunting lodge, a neo-medieval hunting lodge. And so, very much like his father at Burghley, he wanted his house to be referenced back to the feudal past, as well as containing modern comforts. In the same perilous period, when he was trying to secure his job over the change of regimes, he also concentrated on building himself a house in London. Now, his father, William, had been given a house on the Strand by Elizabeth I, and this is a plan of it that's at Burghley House, and you can see it was a large house with 2 courtyards. This is the Strand here. These are gardens going back to Covent Garden up here. Great hall, staircase, and first floor rooms. It was large enough for him to throw really quite large parties. But as a boy, Robert Cecil's living in one of the wings of the house. But of course, this house is inherited by his half-brother Thomas, and he is forced to buy his own house. And he does that on the Strand nearby. It becomes Salisbury House. You see a picture of it here. And in the Bodleian Library, there are a series of plans which show the house as it was in about 1612. And here is the Strand along the bottom. You came off the street into a handsome courtyard. There was a great hall. You then went up the stairs into a suite of rooms on the first floor. This is a ground floor plan, in which he was able to live and, much more importantly, to entertain. Well, you know, I think Robert Cecil was actually rather glad to get rid of Tybbalds. It had become a behemoth, guzzling his money. But its transfer to the king left him with only Pym's house near London in Edmonton. And therefore he decided to build himself a new out-of-town residence at Hatfield, which of course was one of the properties transferred to him in exchange for Tybbalds. Like his father, Robert was a hands-on patron. And during the 5 years that Hatfield House took to build, he stayed in the parsonage at Hatfield with his wife and children, so he could supervise work going on in detail. There was no one designer, and Robert took a major role in all the decisions. But Simon Basil from the Office of Works and the architect Robert Limming were probably key in helping to formulate the design. It cost the colossal amount of £38,000, and Cecil died in 1612, just before it was completed. The plan and the elevation of Hatfield House owe a great deal to Tybbalds. The use of brick with stone dressings, the big square blocks at the corners joined by a lower section, the architrave, frieze and cornice running round the whole building, the balustrades, the flat roofs, the little dome turrets, the the central clock tower and the open loggia all take their cue from Tibbal's. And of course, Limming had worked there and Robert Cecil had lived there. So there is a logic to this. But I think, to me, there's almost a sense in which the house was almost a tribute to his father, William. And in 1611, when Robert had moved in, a portrait of his father adorned his study in his private suite. Well, these days, a visit to Hatfield gets you as close as you can get to the world of the early Cecils. The astonishing, ravishing grand stair finished in 1611. The great chamber containing the marble fireplace carved by Maximilian Colt, the king's carver, that bears a bronze statue of James I presented to Cecil by the king himself. These are more or less as Robert Cecil would have known them. But what is, in my opinion, one of the most gorgeous rooms in all England is Cecil's long gallery. It's been altered, but not to its detriment. It still has its original ceiling and its fireplaces. William Cecil seems to have decided quite early on that in Thomas, his eldest son and heir, the future of the family did not reside. He famously was to say that he was meet only to keep a tennis court. Yet this was a little bit unfair. Thomas had a successful career under Elizabeth as a soldier and a courtier, and after his father's death as a regional magnate based at Burghley. On the accession of James I, he was made a member of the Privy Council, and in 1605, at the age of 62 years old, he was made Earl of Exeter, at the same time as Robert was created Earl of Salisbury. Thanks to his father amassing property in Lincolnshire and Northamptonshire, he was never short of money, and his marriage to Dorothy Neville brought him an inheritance when her father died without a male heir. And through Dorothy came Snape Castle, which you see on my map here in Yorkshire. This was an extremely useful inheritance, as Thomas received a commission from the Queen to be Lord President of the Council of North, a job that came with special orders to hunt down Catholic recusants. Snape was a convenient base for the duties that kept him in the north of England, and in the 1580s, Thomas undertook a remodelling there. The core of the place was medieval, and just as his half-brother had done at Cranbourne, Thomas opted for a remedievalising of the building rather than an outright modernisation. 4 battlemented corner towers give the castle its distinctive skyline, 2 of which were added by Thomas. But he was also a patron of modern architecture and commissioned 2 of the most interesting houses of his generation. And the first of these was at Wimbledon, where he had grown up. In 1575, his father granted him the family house there, and the following year he bought the nearby manor house, its gardens, and its park from Sir Christopher Hatton. And he started from scratch, choosing a new location for his house, cut into the side of the hill. Here is the house. The land rises here steeply, and on terraces behind this house, he cut really remarkable and beautiful gardens. Here you see the house and the rising land behind, and here you see a symmetrical house to an H-plan, bay windows, capped stair towers, flat parapet. These are all very familiar Cecil architectural devices. But I think the compactness of the plan and the magnificence of its setting were remarkable. The house was not large. You see its plan here. It was actually only 1 deep. There was a great hall, a staircase that led to a gallery, and perhaps the most remarkable feature, this chapel here, which was open at this side to the rest of the house and to the great stair, so that this great Protestant aristocrat could make sure that his household could hear prayers being said each day. A chapel that perhaps suited a persecutor of papists. The second new building that Thomas commissioned was on the Burghley estate, and here you see a detail from an estate map. It wasn't far from Burghley House itself, only about a mile away, and this was a retreat where Thomas and his friends could stay to hunt, race horses, play bowls, eat, drink, and be merry. The building, which was attached to two service ranges, here are the service ranges, was effectively a cross, a Greek cross. These lateral ranges contained extensive kitchens and cellars to presumably facilitate the carousing. Its external form was one of the then very fashionable devices where the plan, tightly constrained, made a very formal letter or a shape. And the architectural devices were harvested from architectural treatises. The architect is unknown, but Thomas, one of the richest men in England, was surely here having fun himself. Well, Robert, who never really enjoyed very good health, died in 1612, and his elder half-brother Thomas outlived him, dying in 1623. Despite a determined effort in 1611-12 to reduce his debts by selling unwanted estates, on his deathbed, Robert still owned the colossal sum of £37,000, almost the entire cost of building Hatfield House. He'd borrowed £61,000 over the previous 4 years, more than half of it from the city. And this he largely invested in buying more land at Hatfield and Cranbourne to make them centres of suitably large estates. Yet, his asset base was enormous, and within a couple of years, his executors had cleared his debts, and his son, William, was in possession of one of the largest landed incomes in the land. Now, handed down from father to son, the Salisbury estates at Hatfield and Cranbourne remain in the hands of his successors, cherished and enjoyed by the family and visitors alike. And likewise, Burghley, in the hands of a family trust, retains its ancestral connections with its builder. So, this is what the big picture looks like. William Cecil sets up his property empire. His eldest son inherits two of them, Burghley House in the country and Burghley House in London, but he builds his own houses as well. The younger son, Robert Cecil, inherits Tibbles and Beaufort House. He builds Salisbury House, Cranbourne Manor, and at Hatfield. Well, in my first lecture, I showed how the Boleyns amassed huge land ownings by brilliant marriages to heiresses and consolidated them through royal service and grants of lands and privileges. The story of the Cecils is just as calculating and systematic, but in an entirely different way. Without the blood to marry into great wealth, two brilliant men, father and son, systematically invested the fruits of royal service into land. They bought, built, amassed, and consolidated. And on the strengths of their many offices, reinforced by palpable royal favour, they borrowed money to buy still more. Both William and Robert looked to the future. They were dynasty building, creating houses and estates that have actually fulfilled their ambition, enduring for 400 years. Their approach to building was different too. The Boleyns were eager to stress their ancient lineage, their aristocratic descent. Owning property was dynastic affirmation. They wanted their houses to look old. Any modernization was carefully judged to bring modern comforts within a pre-existing structure. Of course, personal preference may have had an influence, but we should remember that the Boleyns were rich enough to commission great houses had they wanted to. The Cecils came from much more humble stock, a fact that their opponents and detractors were very keen to point out. But the family was out to establish itself, not only through architecture, but through the totality of an estate with a capital mansion at its heart. These mansions made references to the ancient feudal rights and obligations of a landowner, such as the Great Hall at Burghley. But they were essentially modern houses built by new men. Yes, they were nouveau riche, and they built in styles that made that clear. And this is an extraordinary pedigree drawn up for William Cecil, which shows his sort of fictional lineage, just demonstrating their desire to create a backstory to their dynasty. Extremely intelligent and ambitious, William and Robert knew they were laying the foundations of a dynasty, and part of their extraordinary success was that their great houses became, in their lifetime, leaders in style. Without the crown leading fashion, the Cecils and their richest contemporaries themselves made fashion and didn't just follow it. Well, I made the point in my first lecture that it was to women that the Boleyns owned their wealth. My last very brief point is that the Cecils were also blessed with remarkable women. One heiress, but much more crucially, Mildred, William Cecil's second wife, who was one of the most brilliant women of her age and who played a crucial role in partnership with William and in the education of Robert. What ties the Boleyns and the Cecils together is their faith in the value of landed estates and property to secure long-term security and achieve upward social mobility. What separates them is the methods they use to achieve it. In my next lecture, on the 17th of March, we look at the Duke of Monmouth and his descendants, and we ask, when you start at the top, is the only way down?
Thank you very much, Simon, for a really interesting lecture. We do have a few questions from the audience. We don't have much time, but we'll try to get through a couple of them if that's okay. You mentioned that William Cecil built his grand houses as status symbols, dynastic seats, but he was regularly at court, so did he spend less time in his country houses than the average great lord? And did this mean that he spent long periods away from his family, or did they stay with him at court?
Well, one of the important things to remember, and it is a really crucial fact, is that, of course, Cecil had lodgings in every single royal palace. So anywhere the Queen went, to any of her own houses, Cecil had not just one room, but a whole suite of rooms. And he spent a great deal of time there and a great deal of time in his house on the Strand. Going to Burghley was a major operation, and he spent very little time there. And of course, that was the reason why he built Tybbalds, because you could get there in a day. And the invention of the coach, which is absolutely vital to the whole geography of Elizabethan and Jacobean London, enabled the monarch and these aristocrats to quite quickly get out of town to this ring of houses outside the city, which included Tybbalds, which allowed him to spend time there. So the answer to the question is a lot of time spent in royal palaces, quite a lot of time spent in the Strand, a bit of time spent at Tybbalds, and getting further out than that was a rare luxury.
Since Burghley House was too far for Elizabeth to visit, do you suppose one of the reasons Cecil made Tybbalds so extravagant was to entice her to visit more often? And did he have to pay for the vast expense of her progress to Tybbalds?
Yes, well, I mean, Tybbalds, he started not as a vast palace for the Queen. He started it for himself and for his son, but it very quickly became a place that Elizabeth liked. And of course, what one has to remember is that the vast majority of Elizabeth's houses were houses that were started by her grandfather and completed by her father. In other words, they were houses that had had their heyday in the 1530s. And they were actually really rather old-fashioned. Quite a lot of them had quite small windows. The plan and the layout was quite complicated because they were accretive structures. What she loved about Tybbalds, a new house at Tybbalds, was that it was large, it was well planned, there were big windows, it was a convenient and comfortable place to live, much more comfortable actually than her own houses. And when she stayed there, her chief minister paid for her, so it was free.
And there's one last question that I'm afraid I can't resist asking. This one comes in from Valerie and says, do you have any comments on the interesting links between Cecil and Sir Thomas Gresham? For example, Gresham sent William Cecil many gifts, including materials for the building of one of his houses.
Well, I really ought to be able to answer that question really well, oughtn't I? I think that when the Cecils were when William Cecil sent his son abroad, he did ask Thomas Gresham to keep an eye on him. And if I remember rightly, he might have even asked him to stop his son from playing quite so much tennis, but I might have got that slightly wrong.
That's about right. And the last question, is it known when Somerset Place was destroyed? Was it destroyed in the Great Fire of London?
No, Somerset Place absolutely was not destroyed then. It became the Palace of English Queens, and it was lived in by Anne of Denmark, by Henrietta Maria, and after the Civil War was handed on to the Queens, and in fact remained property of English Queens until the reign of George III, by which stage it was terribly old-fashioned, and a swap was done whereby the government was given the old house at Somerset House. It was knocked down and turned into government offices, whilst George III got the building that we now know as Buckingham Palace.
I think that's all we have time for this evening. Thank you very much, Simon, again, for a wonderful lecture, and thank you to our audience for attending. I want to assure you that we will be continuing with our lectures during the period of increased national restrictions. So please do join us next week when we have the first lecture from our visiting Professor of Economic History, Professor Martin Daunton, and also the Naylor Memorial Lecture on Defence, presented by Dr. Sophie Antrobus. Thank you very much and good evening.